Hello, welcome all again to one of our monthly discussions here at Juris North. Once again, the idea in our discussions is to have one specialist, one expert, and then open the floor to questions and answers. Thanks to our expert today, we'll be recording the very first part of the session, her presentation, in order to be able to share with all of whom couldn't come today. So welcome, my friend, I have to say, Dr. Yasmine Nahlawi, a PhD from Newcastle University. I've known Yasmine for several years now. And Yasmine will be talking about part of her research because she recently published a book I recommend as well because I read part of the book when it was a proposal. The responsibilities to protect in Libya and Syria, R2P in Libya and Syria. And today she will be talking very briefly about the responsibility not to veto and the Syrian conflict. Yasmine, a pleasure to have you here with us again. Thank you very much for joining Juris North once more. And
hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jorge, and thanks for always reaching out to me to make sure that Syria is represented in the academic endeavors that you take part in. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. So today I'm going to be talking about the veto in the Security Council and the potential that the veto has on, to impart ramifications on mass atrocity situations. So for the first part of my talk, I'm going to be focusing on more theoretical aspects of the veto, talking about it from a legal perspective. And then the second part, I'm going to look at how it's applicable to the Syrian context. So to begin with, as we all know, there is a democratic deficit in the Security Council. So there are 15 member states in the council. 5 of them are permanent: the US, UK, France, Russia, and China. So these 5 states, or the P5 as they're called, in addition to having a permanent seat on the Security Council, they also have the right to the veto, which means that they have the right to block any draft resolution that is proposed in the Security Council. So even if, let's say, theoretically, 14 out of 15 states vote in favor of a resolution, if only one of the P5 votes against it, then the resolution does not get adopted. Now, the right to the veto is incorporated into the UN Charter. It's incorporated into Article 27. And the interesting thing is, if we want to amend the veto, or if we want to change it, restrict it, or remove it, as per Article 108 of the Charter, we have to get a 2/3 majority vote at the General Assembly, plus the 5 affirmative votes of the P5 members themselves. So they basically have to agree to limit their own veto power, and that's never going to happen. So formally restricting the veto is pretty much impossible. But at the same time, we see the ramifications that the veto can impart on mass atrocity situations. So when we look at situations such as Syria or others that are ongoing throughout the world, in China against the Uyghur minority, in Myanmar, in Palestine, what we see is a pattern whereby these atrocity situations don't just impact the people within the specific countries, but they impart ramifications on the international community as a whole. And that's why it's widely recognized that the prohibition of genocide, of war crimes, of crimes against humanity are community interests. These are interests that every single country has a stake in and is affected by if they're breached. And we see that in Syria, for example. So the conflict in Syria hasn't just had a destructive effect on the Syrian population, it's destabilized neighboring countries. It's resulted in a refugee crisis, and we feel that in every corner of the world. It's also resulted in the emergence of terrorism, and we've also felt the effects of that in every corner of the world. So what happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria, and that's the same for pretty much any other mass atrocity situation. So that tells us of the significance of responding to these cases and making sure that the international community has a robust mechanism of dealing with these cases. So where does the Security Council come into play? So under the responsibility to protect, which was developed in 2001, the idea is that the primary responsibility to protect populations lies with states themselves. So each state has the primary responsibility to protect its own people. And if the state fails, then that responsibility gets passed on to the international community. So the international community should first provide support, And if that fails, then it should intervene directly to alleviate the situation. So obviously a response to a mass atrocity situation can occur outside the Security Council. It doesn't have to be restricted to that body. But the Council has a very big significance in two ways. So first of all, the Security Council is the only international body that can authorize the use of force absent self-defense. And secondly, it is also the only body that can authorize binding mandatory obligations on all UN member states. So given these powers that the Security Council has, it is quite significant in responding to mass atrocity situations. And that also means by default that the right of the veto that's held by the US, UK, France, Russia, and China also has a disproportionate ability to block and thwart international responses to mass atrocity situations. So over the past years, there have been some initiatives to limit the right of the veto, at least in mass atrocity situations. So the idea is that if there's a mass atrocity situation, if there's genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity being committed, then we want the P5 to restrict the right to the veto. So there were some initiatives. In 2001, when R2P was coined, the report that established R2P, the report of the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, they recommended a code of conduct for the P5. They asked them to refrain from vetoing unless their vital national interests were at stake. But that was not taken forward. The P5 opposed it, and when R2P was further developed, the right to the veto or the restriction or potential restriction of the veto was taken out. In 2012 and 2013, there were other initiatives to limit the use of the veto in mass atrocity situations, but the pressure from the P5 themselves was enough to rescind these proposals. So as it stands today, there's no formal restriction of the veto. As I mentioned earlier, in the UN Charter, it's an unrestricted right. But with that said, and what's interesting is that the veto can nevertheless, and one can make the argument that it can still be contrary to states' other international legal obligations. So for example, we have the duty to prevent genocide as per the Genocide Convention. We have the duty to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. We have the duty to cooperate to bring to an end serious breaches of Jus Cogens norms. The UN Charter itself contains a good faith obligation, which means that member states have to fulfill their obligations in good faith. Now, some of these obligations contained within the UN Charter include human rights aspirations. They also include a primary responsibility for the Security Council to maintain international peace and security. So you could make the argument that the P5 must discharge this primary responsibility of the Security Council in good faith. So I guess the big picture is there is no formal limitation to the veto, and past efforts to restrict the veto have been unsuccessful, and that's very unsurprising because the P5 will never agree. But with that said, we can make the argument that the veto could be contrary to the P5's other international legal obligations. There has yet to be a formal challenge to the veto on these grounds, and I think this is where we can potentially have some legal activism by certain states in the future. So there has been no formal challenge to the veto yet. So as it stands, the P5 can veto whatever draft resolution they want, even in the face of genocide, theoretically, and there's no legal mechanism to hold them to account as of yet. So now I'll pivot from that theoretical discussion on the veto, and I'll talk about Syria. Now, since the Syrian conflict started almost 10 years ago now, Russia and China together have vetoed 16 different draft resolutions on the conflict. Now, their justifications for the veto have been that the draft resolutions that were proposed in the Security Council were biased against the Syrian state, and that they were interventionist, and that they opened the door for regime change. So what I've done is I've analyzed these different resolutions and their provisions to see, how these arguments can hold up. And I want to present 4 arguments for characterizing the Russian and Chinese vetoes as abusive. So the first one is, as I mentioned, Russia and China have said that these draft resolutions were biased, that they were interventionist, and they paved the way for regime change. But of the 16 draft resolutions, only 3 of them invoke Chapter 7. And as you all will know, Chapter 7 is the precursor to authorizing the use of force. So only 3 of them invoke Chapter 7. And even when you look at the 3 Chapter 7 draft resolutions that were vetoed, they were not in the context of authorizing the use of force. So the May 2014 draft resolution, for example, sought to refer the Syrian situation to the ICC. The July 2012 draft resolution also sought to impose a range of non-military measures, and it threatened additional measures under Article 41 of the Charter if Syria's non-compliance was forthcoming. So, and Article 41 also, as you may know, it refers with the non-military competencies of the Security Council under Chapter 7. So if the draft resolution wanted to refer to the military competencies, it would have had to refer instead to Article 42 rather than 41 of the Charter. And similarly, the February 2017 draft resolution also specifically invoked Article 41, again dealing with non-military measures. So even the 3 Chapter 7 draft resolutions that were vetoed were drafted in the context of non-military measures. And even beyond that, some of the other draft resolutions that weren't in, that did not invoke Chapter 7 included language along the lines of, nothing in this resolution authorizes the use of military force, or we agree that there is no military solution to the Syrian conflict. So very explicit indications that these draft resolutions are not authorizing force or regime change. So that's the first argument, is that when you look at the actual text of the resolution, it's clear that they were not interventionist and they were not about regime change. The second argument has to do with Russia's national interests in particular. So Syria is the host to the only Russian military base outside the former Soviet Union. So Syria is a very critical ally for Russia, and it's one that it will not give up on very easily. And we've seen that through Russia's direct intervention in Syria in 2015. So it's no longer the case that Russia is propping up Assad, sending him arms, sending him money. No, Russia is in Syria with its military. It is conducting airstrikes on behalf of the Assad regime. It is conducting military operations on the Assad regime. So these vested national interests that Russia has within Syria and its direct involvement in the conflict is another argument for the abusiveness of its veto. The third argument is the commission of the crimes. The continued commission of the crimes is another indicator of the abusiveness of the vetoes. So, you could make the argument, some states may legitimately disagree with certain measures that are being proposed in any draft resolution. So they may not think that they're the most conducive to resolving the situation. So, for example, the African Union in the Libyan context was against the use of military force, not because it was aligned with then dictator Muammar Gaddafi, but rather because it argued that military intervention wasn't the most conducive to resolving the situation in the long term. So it was a disagreement on the means, but not the goal of civilian protection. So there are sometimes, you could say that the use of the veto is legitimate and countries may legitimately disagree with certain measures. However, when the mass atrocity situation continues to prolong, then it becomes increasingly difficult to justify the use of the veto in these contexts. So Russia and China have argued that they are pursuing alternative diplomatic routes. Clearly, these diplomatic routes are not working because the conflict has been continuing to deteriorate, so it becomes harder to justify the vetoes. And the final argument that I want to make pertains to the attitudes of states around the world. So within the Security Council, states have been very vocal in criticizing the vetoes exercised by Russia and China, and even departing from traditional diplomatic protocols. So traditionally in the Security Council, if you want to voice your disagreement with another state, you would couch your language. So you would say something along the lines of, we disagree with certain states that have voted negatively today, for example. And they wouldn't specifically name the countries that they disagreed with. But in the Syrian context, countries became increasingly vocal about naming and shaming Russia and China for their uses of the veto. And even beyond the Security Council, the General Assembly adopted at least 3 resolutions where it condemned Security Council failure on Syria. And that's quite big because this is basically one UN body condemning the failure of another body. So in resolutions in August 2012, in December 2013, and December 2016, the General Assembly adopted resolutions by over a 90% margin in each of the 3 cases, using language such as deplore the failure of the Security Council, or reminding the Security Council of its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security. So quite strong language from the General Assembly. So these 4 arguments, again, a look at the actual provisions of the draft resolutions, the national interests of Russia in particular, the continued commission of crimes in Syria over the years, and finally the attitudes of states, I believe paints a very comprehensive picture for characterizing the Russian and Chinese vetoes as abusive. Now, the final theme that I want to look at is to look at the repercussions that these vetoes have had on the trajectory of the Syrian conflict. So they've imparted 2 main repercussions in my view. The first one is that the draft resolutions that were being proposed, obviously, were not adopted. So that's the first effect that they had. And these draft resolutions sought to impose a wide range of measures, including on humanitarian access, on chemical weapons use, on ceasefires, on the referral of the situation to the ICC. So in the first instance, these provisions were never adopted. But secondly, and possibly more importantly, is that the resolutions that the Security Council did manage to adopt on Syria were completely unenforceable and watered down because they had to be watered down to enlist Russian and Chinese support, or at the very least, their acquiescence. So they were so watered down to get their approval that they were completely unenforceable, and thus they were routinely violated. And I'll give you 2 examples here. The first is with the chemical weapons issue. So you probably all remember, especially in 2013, President Obama drew a very strong red line and saying that this red line would potentially lead to military intervention if Syria crossed it. And in August of 2013, the regime did cross it and it committed a chemical attack against Ghouta. And to avoid a potential military intervention, the diplomatic routes were catalyzed, and the Security Council was able to adopt Resolution 2118 the next month, so in September of 2013. This resolution, it condemned the use of chemical weapons. It characterized their use as a threat to international peace and security. It called for the removal and the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal, and it threatened additional measures under Chapter 7 if Syria's noncompliance was forthcoming. So the resolution itself wasn't adopted under Chapter 7, but it threatened additional measures. And to so many people, this Security Council mobilization around chemical weapons was a huge success. Surely enough, following this resolution, the Security Council adopted an additional 4 resolutions between then, so 2013 and 2016. So total, we have 5 resolutions on chemical weapons use. Big Security Council success. They finally able to come together. But actually, my argument is that it was a big failure. Because the chemical weapons attacks never stopped in Syria. They may, for a while, they may have become smaller in scale, but the reality is that they never stopped. And what we saw was a cycle where the regime would employ chemical weapons, and the council would adopt more resolutions and threaten additional Chapter 7 measures if there was non-compliance. More chemical attacks, an additional threat to employ measures under Chapter 7. So we had 4 or 5 threats to employ Chapter 7 measures, but those threats never actually materialized. And then in 2017, the Security Council was paralyzed again on the chemical weapons issue. And between 2017 and 2018, Russia and China vetoed 6 different draft resolutions pertaining exclusively with chemical weapons use in Syria. And one of the arguments, or one of the things that happened behind the scenes, was that the independent body that they had appointed to examine chemical weapons use in Syria came out with findings that Russia didn't like. Namely, the findings were that Assad was committing these chemical attacks, and Russia didn't like the findings. So it disagreed with the methodology, it disagreed with the accuracy of the reports, and thus it started vetoing draft resolutions. And in 2017 and 2018, you may also remember the regime it became emboldened by these vetoes, and it committed 2 additional large-scale chemical attacks in April 2017 and April 2018 against Khan Sheikhoun and Douma. And in both instances, the United States retaliated with military strikes, the first time by itself and the second time along with the UK and France. So here we saw the Security Council was completely, it was completely out of the picture. Its relevance was put off completely to the side. So on the chemical weapons issue, where some analysts will say that's the Security Council's success, actually what we see is that the resolutions that were adopted were unenforceable. They continued to be violated, and any action that did occurred outside the purview of the council. Another sphere or remit that I can point out to is the issue of humanitarian access, and that's another issue where the Security Council has been able to adopt resolutions. But maybe by now the theme that we should say is resolutions. The adoption of resolutions doesn't necessarily mean progress. So here the Security Council adopted a resolution in July of 2014, Resolution 2165. And that resolution called on all parties in Syria to provide unrestricted access to UN aid agencies and their implementing partners. And that resolution was renewed. Let me just to get this accurate, 7 times. It remains applicable as of today. But the reality is that this unrestricted access has never been forthcoming. So what we've seen throughout the conflict and since the adoption of this resolution and the subsequent renewals is the regime will either divert aid to areas that are loyal to it or that are under its control to satisfy its loyalist base, basically, or if it is put under immense pressure to allow aid convoys into a certain area, then it will restrict the types of goods that can be delivered. So in 2016, for example, with the city of Daraya had been under siege for 4 years, and there was an immense political pressure on the regime to allow aid convoys into the city. So when the convoys were finally allowed in, the only deliverables they brought with them were things like mosquito nets, anti-lice shampoo, thankfully baby formula, but all the food items had been taken out. So this is yet another example of cases where the Security Council did mobilize, but because the resolutions were so unenforceable, they were routinely violated, and I don't know how much practical effect we can say they imparted. So, to bring it all to conclusion, and tying this back to the idea of the veto, moving forward, I think we need to seriously rethink this concept of the veto. And like I mentioned, currently there has been no formal legal challenge against the use of the veto in mass atrocity situations. There are legal arguments that one can present against the unrestricted use of the veto. However, if we do not see these either formal or informal restrictions of the veto, then what we may see is the circumventing of the Security Council. So states may choose to overcome the paralysis in other ways. And there are various ways that this can happen, including through, for example, humanitarian intervention. And I don't think that most people are going to be proponents of that because there's a very high potential for that to be abused. One route that I am in favor of is through the General Assembly. I think the General Assembly has latent powers that it hasn't used or fully utilized with respect to responding to situations. But I think that the General Assembly competencies are a subject of a whole discussion on their own. I'm happy to take questions on it if there are any, but I'll leave it out here and open it up to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yasmine Nahlawi, and I'm going to stop the recording now so we can start our discussion. Thank you very much again, Yasmine.
Thank you.